take a second right now and ask yourself a really serious question. Who actually controls your reality? I mean, is it you, or are there subtle forces, maybe individuals, maybe even massive institutions, quietly writing the script of your life without you even noticing? Well, welcome to today's Explainer. We are taking a deep, super fascinating journey through some incredible source materials today to really understand reality distortion. We're going to start by exploring how manipulation happens on a micro interpersonal level, and then, using some pretty provocative texts, we'll see how those exact same dynamics get mirrored on a massive cultural scale. It's going to be a wild ride.
Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. First, we'll unpack the Narcissist's playbook, and then the anatomy of gaslighting. From there, we'll bridge the gap to systemic narcissism and neurodivergence. And finally, we'll break down the psychology of the story and give you the actual tools to set ironclad boundaries.
All right, let's dive right in with Section 1, the Narcissist's playbook, and the specific tactics of interpersonal abuse. So before we can even begin to understand systemic reality distortion, we absolutely have to look at the micro level first. How do narcissists target, groom, and ultimately trap their victims? Well, narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, is actually defined in the DSM-5 by three main things: grandiosity, a constant need for admiration, and a profound, total lack of empathy. Our sources from Psychology Today highlight something crucial here. To a narcissist, relationships aren't about mutual connection at all. They're literally just a means to an end. They kind of scan the room, categorizing people based on how they can be used. And they groom targets by finding their vulnerabilities and inserting themselves to build total dependence. And once a target is hooked, their world just starts to shrink. Dr. Perpetua Neo outlines 8 specific isolation tactics in our source text, and it's insidious. It usually starts subtly, isolating you from friends and family by just planting little seeds of doubt. Then they use intermittent reinforcement, keeping you totally confused by constantly alternating between extreme kindness and extreme cruelty. They dictate what can and cannot be said. They actively sabotage the hobbies that give you your identity. They prevent you from making new friends. They might even sabotage your career to make sure you're financially dependent on them. They gaslight your reality. And in the most extreme cases, they'll even confiscate your phone or laptop under the guise of teaching you a lesson. The whole point is to overwhelm you, making them your absolute only lifeline. And if you try to confront them about this behavior, the difference between a healthy apology and a narcissist's non-apology is honestly staggering. A healthy apology requires real empathy. It focuses entirely on the pain caused to the other person, and it takes full responsibility. But a narcissist's apology? It's basically a masterclass in excuses. They'll shift the blame right back onto you, the victim. They'll quibble over the exact words you use just to avoid taking any real accountability. Because at the end of the day, their fragile self-image simply cannot handle the concept of actually being at fault. Moving right along to Section 2, the anatomy of gaslighting and how they rewire your internal compass. If isolation sets the stage, gaslighting is the core weapon they use to keep control. Our source material from The Brink defines gaslighting very specifically. It's not just a lie. Actually, scratch that, it's straight up psychological warfare. It's a sustained, calculated pattern of behavior that deliberately denies events, rewrites entire conversations, and completely minimizes your emotions. A single lie is just deception, right? But when someone repeatedly looks you in the eye and says, "That never happened," or "You're just being too sensitive," they're actively dismantling your internal compass. The goal isn't just to win an argument, it's to destabilize your certainty so completely that they become your only reliable source of truth. There's this fantastic quote from Matt Hussey that hits the nail on the head. He says, "Gaslighting doesn't work because victims are naive. It works because the human brain is social." And that's so true. We are biologically wired to check our reality against the people we trust. It's a psychological mechanism called social verification. So when an abusive partner or even a boss totally contradicts what you saw with your own eyes, it creates this massive cognitive dissonance. And because we're so deeply driven by social attachment, victims will unconsciously choose to doubt their own sanity rather than face the terrifying reality of losing that bond. Okay, let's zoom out for Section 3, systemic narcissism and neurodivergence. This is the macro mirror. So what happens when these exact same abusive tactics are used by giant institutions? Our sources do this incredible thing where they map interpersonal abuse directly onto systemic equivalents. Where an individual gaslights a partner, the text argues that institutions engage in societal gaslighting. Where a toxic individual demands strict conformity to their specific rules, systemic structures actually pathologize natural human neurodivergence. And where an abuser isolates and controls, The author points to the historical and modern enforcement of colonial norms and carceral eugenics to control populations deemed undesirable. We are grounding this macro analysis in a very specific source text today, Autism in America by Isha Sarah Snow. The author presents a trauma-informed guide to systemic oppression and argues that our modern neurotypical systems of governance are actually rooted in relational disconnection and trauma. It's a deeply provocative thesis that views our societal structures as operating with the exact same lack of empathy and the exact same demand for compliance as a clinical narcissist. The text lays out some really strong, specific socio-political critiques here. The author uses this term Eurocentric narcissism to describe a widespread cultural demand for conformity to colonial norms. The text also traces the really dark history of carceral eugenics, how institutions have historically locked away and controlled disabled and neurodivergent people to regulate so-called undesirable bodies. The author frames all of this as the deficit delusion, basically arguing that society pathologizes natural human neurodivergence instead of recognizing it as a perfectly valid evolutionary adaptation. Ultimately, the claim is that these systems hold onto their power by creating these artificial us versus them dichotomies, forcing a very strict narrative of what is considered normal. We're exploring these assertions impartially today, just to see how institutions can, structurally, mirror narcissistic abuse. Which brings us to Section 4, the psychology of the story or narrative reconstruction.
Whether we're talking about a toxic partner or a huge institution, their absolute favorite tool of control is the narrative. To really understand how they hook us, our sources pull a brilliant metaphor from the commercial psychology of video storytelling. Marketers use a very specific structure to keep us watching. They create a relatable character, plant a hook to grab attention, introduce conflict, exploit emotional triggers, and then finally provide a resolution. Now, think about the narcissist playbook we just went over. It's the exact same thing. They frame themselves as a relatable victim. They hook you with charm. They engineer constant conflict and tension. They absolutely exploit your emotional triggers, like your empathy or your fears, and then they offer a resolution, but only if you completely comply with their version of reality. They're using the raw power of story to keep you trapped.
All right, let's get to the good stuff. Section 5, setting ironclad boundaries and reclaiming your reality. Here is the really good news. You can absolutely become the main character of your own life again. The sources make one thing perfectly clear. Boundaries are your absolute first line of defense against reality distortion. Period. Whether it's coming from a toxic person or an oppressive system. Research from the NIH even shows that the chronic stress from these dynamics literally damages your physical health. So boundaries act as this vital protective barrier. And remember, they aren't about trying to change the narcissist or suddenly overthrow the system. They are entirely about protecting your own psychological space and ensuring your reality is respected. So how do we actually execute this? We've synthesized a clear 6-step action plan right from our clinical sources. Step 1. Understand what you're dealing with and fully expect pushback. They will test your limits, for sure. Step 2. Communicate directly and assertively. Leave zero room for interpretation. Step 3. Use I statements. Focus on your needs rather than arguing about their behavior. Step 4. Set really firm limits and clearly define the consequences if they cross them. Step 5 is huge. Practice unwavering emotional detachment. Do not feed them the emotional reaction they're desperately looking for. And Step 6. Prioritize self-care and get professional support. Consistency is your armor here. When you consistently enforce your boundaries, you stop outsourcing your reality. Which leaves us with one final, absolutely vital question to close out this explainer. Who is writing the story of your reality? Once you start recognizing these tactics of reality distortion, from the micro-isolation of a toxic partner to the macro-gaslighting of systemic institutions, you take the pen back. By setting ironclad boundaries and trusting your own internal compass, you reclaim the power to write your own script. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive today. And remember, always keep questioning the narrative.